Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Current Consulting Group and sponsored by DrugPak. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled The Right Test at the Right Time, Building Better Drug Testing Programs. Today's webinar qualifies for one continuing education credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attend in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for that credit. Once again, today's sponsor is DrugPak. DrugPak has been a trusted name in the industry for over 35 years. When it first launched, it was the only comprehensive drug testing management software available. As the drug testing industry has evolved, so has DrugPak. At the forefront of innovation, DrugPak processes data faster and more efficiently. By integrating directly with laboratories and MROs, it helps transform the way business is done in drug testing, making it easier for providers to deliver results to their clients. Today, DrugPak is web-based, mobile-enabled, customizable, and fully scalable to meet the needs of any drug testing program. The DrugPak team is passionate about creating software solutions that support the industry's diverse and evolving needs. Please visit drugpak.com to book a free guided demo tailored to your testing program, or email your questions to sales@drugpak.com. Today's presentation welcomes the founder and president of the Current Consulting Group, Bill Current. Among Bill's many accomplishments, he founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998. He is the former VP of consulting at Employee Information Services. He is a former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education. He is the former director of the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace. He has authored 11 books on substance abuse prevention and drug testing, including his 2026 release, What Every Employer Should Know About Marijuana. And lastly, Bill is currently a member of the Board of Directors at Endesa and Board of Trustees at the Endesa Foundation. With us, we also have the Senior Vice President of the Current Consulting Group, Brian Feely. Brian has more than 40 years of experience in the medical diagnostics industry. He is named as an inventor on 4 patents in the diagnostics field, is an author of numerous publications, and speaks frequently at industry meetings and workshops. He is considered an expert in the science, sales, and marketing of drug and alcohol testing products, with a particular focus on the merits of oral fluid drug testing. Brian is also well-versed in compliance services such as drug testing policy, training for supervisors and employees, and state and federal law issues. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to one of our presenters, Bill Current.
Well, thank you very much, Greta, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I just want to pause for a minute and just thank DrugPak for sponsoring today's presentation. As many of you may know, the Current Consulting Group conducts a survey of the drug testing industry, and we've done this for 28 years. We just presented the results of our 28th annual drug testing industry survey at the Endesa conference in Anaheim just a handful of weeks ago. And part of that survey includes a kind of a sub-survey within it on brand name recognition, where we ask people in the industry, what are the top 3 recognized brands in different categories: lab-based urine testing, point of collection urine testing, rapid result oral fluid testing, lab-based oral fluid testing, etc. And in the category of drug testing software and cloud management, DrugPak is recognized as the #1 recognized brand in that category. So congratulations to them for that. And also thank you again for sponsoring today's webinar presentation. I'm also very excited to be co-presenting with Brian Feely, who Brian and I have known each other for decades now, and we love working together at Current Consulting Group. He does a lot of things here. It'd take a webinar just to explain all the things Brian does here at CCG, but we're going to be co-presenting today. And these are some of the services that we provide in addition to the surveys that we do every year of the industry and of employers. So here's today's agenda. We're going to talk about identifying the most common reasons why employers conduct drug testing, and then determining which testing method or methodology is best based on the circumstances. And we'll get into very detailed explanations there. And then we'll talk about, briefly, we'll talk about the sort of the key compliance considerations. Those have to do with state laws and federal regulations. That alone would be, a 2-part webinar series, but we'll touch on it at the very end as it relates to the things that we talked about today. So let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot of ground to cover. The most common reasons employers conduct drug testing, and throughout today's presentation, we're going to invite you to participate by being part of some polls that we're going to conduct. And so let's turn it back over to Greta for poll number 1. Greta.
Thank you, Bill. I'll go ahead and launch our first poll. What is the primary reason your organization conducts workplace drug testing? To promote workplace safety, to comply with DOT requirements, to comply with other federal or state requirements, to hire the best possible job candidates, or to reduce legal and liability risks? I'll give everyone a few seconds. Okay. And the results are 63% said to promote workplace safety, 16% said to comply with DOT requirements, 5% said to comply with other federal or state requirements, 0% to hire best possible job candidates, and 16% said to reduce legal and liability risks.
Right, thank you, Greta. And let's now look at the results from our 2026 drug testing industry survey, where we asked, let me back up a second here. I know we're doing this live, Greta, so I'm not doing an erase here, but I just want to clarify something. Here's the survey results we're going to establish. Now, these survey results, the ones you're seeing on the screen here, are from our 2025 employer survey. So we do an industry survey, and then we do an employer survey. This is from the employer survey. Why establish and maintain a drug testing program? Very similar to what you just told us as you participated in our poll, safety being the #1 motivation for putting a drug testing program together. True in today's poll, 78% said the same thing in our 2025 employer survey. Now, #2, to comply with the DOT regulations, and #3, to minimize legal risks. Very similar. Those are the other priorities that you mentioned in the poll that we conducted today. So thank you for participating in that. That's very helpful. These are the results of our employer survey from last year. We'll be releasing the results of our 2026 employer survey in a few months at the SAPA conference in Minneapolis. But if you're interested in knowing more about our surveys or past survey results, just let us know, and we'll get some information, some links out to you so you can take a look at those. So let's kind of build on that now and talk about why you drug test, why you drug test determines when you drug test. So, there's pre-employment testing, reasonable suspicion, post-accident random, and then lesser, but also part of the process for many companies, return to duty, follow-up testing, and pre-duty or pre-access testing. So why you test for safety, to comply with DOT regulations, etc., will determine when you test. As I'm going to talk about in a minute, for example, under the DOT regulations, you must conduct pre-employment testing. It's optional, of course, but it's allowed in every state for non-DOT. But why you drug test will determine whether or not you want to do pre-employment testing. So there are other considerations to take into account. Do you want recent drug use detection or long-term lifestyle drug use detection? Do you want immediate results, or do you have time to send the sample to a laboratory and wait for 24 to 72 hours to get the result back? And what's your primary focus? Is it the bottom line? Is it how much drug tests cost, or how much drug abuse is costing you? And then, are you required to test? And if so, by whom? As I mentioned, under the DOT regulations, all of the boxes that you see on the right of the screen there are part of a DOT drug testing program. We'll talk about those in more specific details, but depending on who's requiring you to test, and there are some states that have specific industry requirements for drug testing. The mining industry, for example, or public works contractors in the state of Illinois. And a lot of those types of programs mirror the DOT regulations, even though they're not DOT programs per se, but they would require the same testing under the same circumstances. So let's break those down one by one. So pre-employment testing, typically takes place before you hire somebody, right? And it's usually and sometimes required by state law to be only conducted after a conditional offer of employment's been made. So that's not always the case, but there are some states that have that conditional offer of employment requirement, okay? It can be limited to applicants for certain occupations. So whereas pre-employment testing is permitted in all 50 states, as you see there in the bottom bullet, there are some times when you're only going to pre-employment screen applicants for certain types of occupations, maybe safety sensitive occupations, okay? That depends, but most states allow that. They allow you to do pre-employment testing to begin with, and sometimes, in almost every instance, they allow you to pre-employment test for the positions that you're most concerned about. Now, in this age of marijuana, there are some things to keep in mind when it comes to pre-employment testing. There are states that in their either medical or recreational marijuana laws, excuse me, in their medical or recreational marijuana laws have specific workplace language specifically pertaining to pre-employment testing for cannabis. And so it may limit it. In some cases, it may prohibit it. And you want to be, familiar with those if you're in those states. But here are 3 examples, 2 states in a municipality. Nevada limits testing within the first 30 days after you hire somebody. And it stipulates that employers cannot refuse to hire someone because they are a registered medical marijuana user. And they may test positive for marijuana, but you can't refuse to hire them based on that if they're a registered medical marijuana user. In New York, the Department of Labor in New York has basically prohibited all testing for cannabis. Although if you read the language very carefully, you'll see that there are some exceptions in certain safety sensitive situations where reasonable suspicion is the reason for the test. And then you could test for cannabis in New York. But generally speaking, New York is a state that doesn't allow employers to test for marijuana. In the city of Philadelphia, it prohibits pre-employment testing for marijuana, okay? And there is, and you'll often see this, there is a safety sensitive carve out in that Philadelphia ordinance. And I believe Pittsburgh is very similar to that, maybe even more restrictive. But lots of times when you see these restrictions, there will be some language in there that sort of carves out safety sensitive occupations and workplaces. So be very careful with that, but stay on top of the legislation. These marijuana laws, which exist in most states now, are constantly in a state of changing to become more restrictive. The door got opened, and now they're looking for different ways to give legal marijuana users more protection and more rights. So you got to look at those and stay on top of it. Now, every year, Quest Diagnostics puts out what's called the Drug Testing Index. That is a report of drug test results from the previous year. So what you're looking at here is the table that shows the positivity rates by reason for the test, pre-employment, random, etc. The first category, table 3, are federally mandated drug test results. And then table 4 are the general U.S. workforce, meaning non-DOT. You can see circled there pre-employment under the DOT would be about 2.4. And for the non-DOT or the general workforce, it'd be 5.1. Excuse me. That's the positivity rate for pre-employment testing from the millions of drug tests that Quest does each year. Let's look at it this way in terms of whether you want to value pre-employment testing. Let's say that you're looking at a company or a location within a company with 1,000 employees. 15%, according to the national average, will be substance abusers. That means you got about 150 current drug users, if not more. According to a study that was done by the University of Chicago, each substance abusing worker costs his or her employer about, on average, $8,800 a year. That means that substance abuse is costing that company with 1,000 employees about $1.3 million a year. Now, if you're a smaller company with 100 employees, applying the same math, you're looking at about $132,000. And if you've got 500 employees, you're looking at a cost of about $660,000. The point is it's relative, right, to the size of your company, but it's also something that you need to be aware of, because when you pre-employment test, you potentially avoid hiring the people that are going to cost you that average of $8,800 a year, right? In many cases, substance abusers will not even apply for a job if they know that there's a pre-employment screen required. And so you're just filtering those people out to begin with, right? Now, look at the last two bullets there. In addition to the average of $8,800 a year, you have the average workers' comp claim of $44,179, which means that if you're in a safety-sensitive workplace, you know, a manufacturing plant, etc., maybe a construction site where there's greater chance of accidents that could result in a workers' comp claim, it's possible that in that work environment, the average cost of a substance abuser could be higher. In fact, for the per average cost of a motor vehicle crash under the workers' comp regulations is just over almost $91,000. Keep that in mind when you look at what the return on investment is from pre-employment testing. Now let's switch our attention to random testing. Now, random testing is, according to SAMHSA, testing using an unpredictable selection process, okay? It's fair, it's unbiased, it can be applied to all your workers depending on the state laws that apply to you or the federal regulations that apply to you, or could apply to a subsegment of your employee population, okay? It has been shown that random testing has the highest deterrent value of all the different circumstances for drug testing. In that way, it reduces accidents, prevents injuries, and saves lives. And it also helps you as a company identify workers who need help, okay? And in that regard, it helps to reduce employer liability. Now, we could do a webinar just on random testing, okay? But it's random. That's the whole idea. Nobody knows who's going to be selected. Anybody could be selected at any point, right? So that deterrent effect is always in place when it comes to random testing. Under the DOT regulations, there are certain DOT or transportation-related safety-sensitive occupations that must be subject to random testing, and it depends on the agency within DOT. You've got the most common one, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the FMCSA, where the majority of all DOT mandated workplace drug tests are under the FMCSA regulations. But you've also got aviation, transit, pipeline, the Coast Guard, which is technically not part of DOT, but was at one time, and so it's included here, and railroad. So to know those specifically, go take a look at them. But let's go back to the Quest Drug Testing Index and look at the positivity rates for random testing. Under the DOT regulations, it's pretty low there, right? Just below 2%. In the non-DOT world, it's just about, what is that, a little over 6%. So why is it so much lower under the DOT regulations? Well, part of that is the fact that the DOT regulations have been in place for a long time. They apply to all safety-sensitive transportation workers in those respective agencies. And you know that even though you don't know when the test is coming, you know you're subject to random testing, so that deterrent effect is there. And I think that speaks volumes to the value of random testing. For non-DOT random testing, it's going to be governed by the state laws that apply to you. So we put some things on here like weighted random testing and testing by location, which is possible, but it's governed by the state laws that apply to you. So before you do something like this, any of the things you see on the screen here, check the state laws that apply to you, or email us and we'll look it up for you and let you know. But non-DOT, governed by state laws. Which state law applies to you if you're in multiple states? All of them, okay? So you need to know all of the state laws. Under the DOT regulations, pretty straightforward. Not a lot of debate, not a lot of negotiation there, okay? I think there's great value in random testing. As I mentioned, some people won't even apply at a company that has pre-employment testing, but the same is true with random testing. Just over 29% of illicit drug users who are employed say they would be less likely to work for a company that conducts random testing. And 6.9% of workers who do not use drugs also say they're less likely to work for a company that conducts random testing. So that alone starts to sort of filter out perhaps what you would consider to be people that you don't want to hire. Okay, that's part of the value of random testing. Now, there's another category called for cause or reasonable suspicion testing. And again, depending on why you test, will determine when you test, right? But if you're looking to identify people who may be impaired while on the job, then you're probably going to want to have a for cause or random testing program. Now, all states permit reasonable suspicion testing, but you want to make sure that the conditions that may apply in a certain state are reflected in your policy when you do drug testing in that state. So be very careful about that. But for cause or random testing can be a very important and very effective drug testing program to have in your company. It does require that you keep your supervisors and managers, the people who will be observing behavior and performance in the workplace, that you keep them trained on how to spot the signs and symptoms of substance abuse. But it tends to be very effective. Let me skip to the next slide. Here's another slide from Quest Diagnostics. You can see, compared to other testing methods, that reasonable suspicion for cause does produce the highest positivity rate of all the different circumstances or reasons for a test. 12.6% under the DOT, the federally mandated category, and over 33% in the non-DOT or the general US workforce. So in other words, when you've got trained supervisors and managers who are specifically trained on how to spot the signs and symptoms of substance abuse and refer somebody for a drug test, lots of times the reason for that is because they are in the workplace under the influence of drugs. So it does produce the highest percentage of positives in drug testing, both in the non-DOT and in the DOT. And then the last one we'll talk about is just post-accident testing. Again, DOT is very specific in what constitutes an accident, when a test has to be placed within a certain time period after the accident. And so the DOT regulations are very specific. In the non-DOT setting, you're governed again by state laws. And so we'd ask you to be very careful, but look up those state laws that apply to you, which is all of the states that you're in. Make sure that if there is a state that defines what an accident is, or as you see in the second bullet there, requires reasonable suspicion of drug use in addition to the accident, then that's reflected in your policy so that when you do conduct a post-accident test, it's justified, it's legally defensible, okay? There are other testing circumstances, and there's many of them. They go by all kinds of different names. Periodic exam testing could be part of an annual physical, return to duty testing after being away from work, typically for some type of treatment, follow-up testing, which may occur during treatment, and like I said earlier, pre-access testing if you're in a certain workplace and everybody who comes into the workplace has to be tested before they can access the workplace. Lots of different circumstances, but again, I would just caution you to look up the state laws that apply to you. That's what's going to govern your decision about whether or not you test for pre-employment and how, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, or any of these other ones that are maybe less common. But if you go back and look at those those Quest positivity rates, let me just go back a couple of slides there. You can see that they do have return to duty and follow-up positivity rates there. So they're valuable. They can be very effective depending on what your objectives are. But again, outside of the DOT regulations or a DOT covered testing situation, you want to make sure that you're following the state laws that apply to you. So with that, let me turn it over to my presentation partner today, Brian Feely.
All right, thanks, Bill. And another shout out to DrugPak. Thanks for sponsoring this webinar today, and thanks to all of you for being on it. I think the topic today is really important, and it's something that people are looking at and always trying to gauge what kind of methods they should be using, what's becoming available. And so this section for the next 10 or so slides, we're going to talk about methods and how they might influence your selection in terms of what types of and applications of drug testing you're doing. So just bring Greta back on to conduct this poll before we get into the next section.
Thank you, Brian. For our second poll, which drug testing method does your organization primarily use today? Laboratory-based urine testing, instant POCT urine testing, laboratory-based oral fluid, instant POCT oral fluid, hair testing. I'll give everyone a few seconds and thank you for participating. Okay. And it looks like 72% said laboratory-based urine testing, 24% instant POCT urine testing, 0% lab-based oral fluid testing, 3% instant POCT oral fluid testing, and 0% hair testing. Back to you, Brian.
Okay, great. That's really interesting. The crowd we seem to have on here today is heavily in utilization of lab-based or instant urine testing. So we'll talk about that and some of the other options. It's just to cover the current drug testing methods. I think everybody's pretty aware of urine and oral fluid and hair testing. Of course, there's different variations of these. As you saw from the poll, there's both the lab-based urine testing and point of collection urine testing. Hair, which is primarily lab, but as an FYI, there's now an instant hair test as well that you can do, where the hair is collected on site, the test is done on site, and then a positive or presumptive positive negative test can be established right there on the spot. Of course, it's followed up with a laboratory-based confirmation test. And then you have laboratory-based oral fluid, which no one on this call, at least that weighed in or voted, is currently using, and then a few people using point of collection oral fluid testing, which is becoming more and more popular for some of the reasons that I think I'm gonna touch on here in a second. This was the same survey that Bill referred to in his slides, an employer survey that we did in 2025. Our next employer survey will be coming up in the fall of 2026, but very much a great representation here of the different reasons that people conduct drug testing. And you know, if you were looking for an employer who was in a safety sensitive operation that really did a good job of creating a mix of the different types of tests they use in their workplace, this would be it. A high percentage for pre-employment testing. They're conducting a lot of random testing. Now, this is, of course, an accumulation of plus 500 companies that weighed in on this, but the numbers and the mix is a really good indication or representation of what a program should look like. You're doing pre-employment, you've got a random testing program, you're conducting reasonable suspicion testing frequently, and as well as post-accident. Follow-up testing is being done, and then lastly, a very low percentage of people who aren't conducting drug testing at all. So this is what people are saying and what they're doing out there. When you look at the why, when, and how, this slide really talks about following up on some of the stuff Bill said, but to deter workplace drug use, you're really looking at, you know, the strongest deterrent is a random testing program. And so when we talk about how, whether you're using oral fluid or urine or hair is a preference to the company at that point, and the logistics of how they select their methodology for that particular location or locations. You know, I won't say it doesn't matter, because you're always going to see variations in positive rates, but the important part here is that you have a random testing program, because it is such a good deterrent. Keeping in mind that the Quest Diagnostics Index showed us that 6.3% of the people tested, at least in 2024, came up positive on random tests. So it's not 0.1% or 0.5%. Even, you know, with random testing programs, you've got 6%. So if you didn't have it at all, you weren't doing random testing, think about what that number might be. So it's important to just do random testing, especially in a safety sensitive program. When you look at reasonable suspicion testing, obviously why is you need to maintain safety in the workplace. You need to respond to incidents and things that are occurring in your workplace, and have your supervisors well trained to be able to spot the signs and symptoms. This is an important part of the program because you need to spot it, you need to document it, you need to know that your supervisors are able to do that. How you do it, there's a pretty strong preference being shown in the market today for using oral fluid, whether it's a lab-based test or a point of collection rapid test. Is again a question of logistics, and can you do the point of collection, the rapid test there on the spot, which is ideal in a reasonable suspicion scenario because you can determine whether you need to get somebody off of the job right there and then. Was that incident really related to use of a substance or not? And the reason oral fluid is such a good choice is because it ties so well to recent use. And so when you have reasonable suspicion, you have a positive oral fluid drug test, those two marry together quite well in terms of telling the story of somebody being potentially impaired on the job. And then, lastly, you look at the hiring practices and the best way to get candidates on the job, whether speed of hiring is your concern or whether it's just getting good people on the job. Pre-employment testing is the answer. And then how you do it, really it's a question of logistics. If you're really looking for same day hiring and doing it quickly, and you don't want to deal with bathrooms and all the hassles that are involved with urine collections and testing today, oral fluid is a great option for your pre-employment screening. We've seen literally, hundreds of companies adopt it for their pre-employment program over the last, 5 to 10 years. I started this 25 years ago with OraSure when I worked there. And the initial application we found was that people really wanted it for that pre-hire application to get people on the job quick. And so urine, of course, and hair can be used if you're looking more for that lifestyle and you're willing to wait the time that would be needed for those results to come back from the lab. But again, it's a question of choice, and that's the beauty of today's drug testing methodologies is they give you choices, whereas in the past, for so many years, it was just urine screening, and that was really the only thing people really looked at or considered. But that's changing pretty rapidly now. When you look at your method and selecting a methodology, it's more than just what are you applying it to. There's these logistics of, does it really have to be a lab-based test because you don't want to be, involved with doing any testing on site. You want to send them to a location, have all that testing done for you, which is fine. And it's typically the way people have gone over time, but it's also the way that, it takes the longest to get your results back. It's also the way if you're doing lab-based urine or urine collections, the way people tend to subvert or cheat their drug tests the most is with a lab-based test. Or can you do point of collection? Can you do that rapid test on site and get the benefit of that? And you need to look at things like the flexibility of the test and the panels. And there's lots of options with both lab-based and point of collection. The accuracy of the test, making sure that you've checked it out and that they hold up well in terms of the studies that were done by the manufacturer. That wasn't just a small set of samples they did. This is something that's really important when you're using a provider to provide you with a method or you're buying it yourself, that you really check out those package inserts and you know what they say and the way the manufacturer conducted those studies and what kind of approval level. In some cases, you have states that require the use of an FDA cleared device. You want to make sure it's also compliant with the regulatory guidelines of that state. Can you do a point of collection test at all in certain states, or must you use a lab-based test? The window of detection, how long am I picking up a drug for? And that's a really important criteria today. Trying to assess impairment becoming more important today as well because of the language that we're seeing coming into certain state laws, which ties right into marijuana and the form you're detecting. Certain states are now adopting language that require you to use tests that do not test for the metabolite of marijuana, which is for past use, an indication of what they did days or weeks ago, but detecting the parent form, which is the psychoactive form of marijuana. And California and Washington are two examples of states that have done that. Then overall cost effectiveness. And hopefully when you're looking at a method, it's not all about the cost or the price. It's really looking at all those things that are important in your program and really picking the best method for you. We'll kind of go through this quick. This is just, an indication of the window of detection with samples like breath and blood and oral fluid. You're really looking at something that somebody just did, recent use. And the beauty of something like an oral fluid test is I'm looking at what did they do before they got to work? What did they do for the work day? If for some reason they're deciding they're going to partake during the day, which does occur from some studies that we've seen. A high percentage of people are either using marijuana before they get to work or on their way to work or even at work. So oral fluid is really going to pick that up very, very much right there on the spot. Urine, there's a lag time before that metabolite shows up in the urine, usually between 6 and 8 hours. We've seen examples where someone will get tested thinking that they smell marijuana and they come up negative on a urine drug screen because the metabolite isn't there yet. It isn't in the urine specimen, but it'll be there with an oral fluid test. And then hair is much longer. So you're looking at weeks to months out, up to 3 months or more, what someone has in their system, and obviously more linked with historical use. So pros and cons, lab-based urine testing, of course, the gold standard, been around for a long, long time. Lots of different panels and availability. Of course, it's permitted by DOT. It's supported in all states. On the downside, though, there is some issues with adulteration and people diluting specimens, and there are some issues with collection sites, the availability, and gender issues. If you need to do an observed collection, that has to be male collecting a male donor. And you have things like shy bladder. People show up at a clinic and say they can't go to the bathroom. The window of detection is not going to necessarily link well to recent use, at least very recent use, when somebody comes in smelling like marijuana. And then costs can fluctuate, but really aligns well with employers in states where they have to adhere to those mandatory drug testing laws that really do specify more of a urine type of an analysis. An instant urine test, of course, has many of the same benefits in terms of applying to urine. There are lots of different products and manufacturers out there. The donor provides the specimen, and it's a very traditional way. But on the downside, because it's a rapid test, you've got to send it to the lab for confirmation, and it's not permitted, of course, for regulated testing. No rapid tests are. And these things are read by eye, so there can sometimes be a little difficulty in interpreting the line on the device. Typically, with good training, that can be overcome pretty easily. So some of the same other downsides, if you will, there. But inexpensive. That's kind of the hallmark of a rapid urine test. It's the method that tends to be the least expensive of all, and all depending upon how you're doing that urine collection, though, and how you're handling that. So use of alternative methodologies like oral fluid and hair, and there's even some other things coming around that look at impairment or potential impairment. These are all tools that we have to keep in mind and begin to, keep an open mind out there, because they can play an important role in your program. The marijuana issue, really, if you're looking at detecting recent use, and that's important in your program, you really want to look at an oral fluid test, either lab-based or rapid. Hair tends to be more lifestyle and habits, so these are good alternative methodologies to look at. And as I mentioned, there's some other tests coming around that look at impairment, and we've been looking at a couple of those and working with a few companies, and they're definitely worth taking a look at. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, for some reason I'm not advancing. Greta, if you can advance the slide, that would be great. Or Bill. Thank you. Pros and cons of lab-based oral fluid testing. This is where oral fluid testing really got started. Was with a lab-based test where you can collect that sample anytime, anywhere. You're not subject to bathrooms and privacy issues. Adulteration is really nearly impossible. And pricing is starting to come in standardized for that. And again, you're getting that recent use, and even time away from work is reduced when you're dealing with an oral fluid collection versus urine. There are a few states where it's not allowed just yet. They'll come around as oral fluid gets implemented for regulated testing. Sometimes you see dry mouth, which can be overcome very easily with some techniques. And then the use of outsourced collection services changes the benefits. If you start doing collections at a collection site, you're offsetting some of the benefits of doing it yourself. Okay, next slide. Okay, instant oral fluid testing, very much aligned with some of the benefits of lab-based, right? You can collect anytime, anywhere. Adulteration issues go away. The difference here being your results are really instant. So you're getting that, fast results, so you can make same-day hiring decisions, again, and getting the benefit of recent use. With an instant oral fluid test, I'll just point out that the THC detection rate is a little different than lab-based oral fluid. Lab tends to go out to probably 24 hours, maybe a little longer with THC. With a rapid test, you're really looking at workday use, something between 6 and 8 hours for most of the rapids that are out there. There is only one FDA cleared device at this time. Perhaps some more will come around, or FDA clearance will become a little less important. We'll see as that unfolds. So hair testing has its pros and cons as well. The window of detection is much longer, and if you're looking at that lifestyle use, it's a really good choice. Gender issues go away. On the downside, none of the methods are SAMHSA approved yet, and there's obviously some collection complications if someone doesn't have hair and you have to go elsewhere on the body. And then historically, there's been some concerns about biases with race or hair color. I think most of those have been pretty well addressed and put to bed. Okay, next slide. I'm going to turn this back over to Bill for the discussion around compliance considerations.
Now, Brian, keep your microphone open for a minute. I just want to ask you a question. In the poll that we conducted, only 3% indicated that they were using oral fluid, but in our 2025 employer survey, we saw a significant jump in the percentage that said they were using oral fluid testing.
Yep.
And you were at OraSure, the #1 recognized brand in oral fluid testing for many years. What is sort of leading many employers toward oral fluid testing now?
Well, I think it's a combination, Bill. It's that ease of collection issue. It's easy to do it pretty much anywhere, anytime, and eliminating that reliance on the collection sites. And we saw this even more as we went through 2020 and with the COVID years. People just didn't want to go to collection sites, and those are many of them had limited hours and operations, and there was concern about people being there sick. So that helped to drive it further. And then people started to get the realization that this recent use thing is really important because of the fact that it picks up the parent drug and not the metabolite, and because it's compliant with any state laws that start to restrict your use of marijuana tests that pick up the metabolite. All these things have started to come together, and it's difficult to really subvert or cheat the test. So you start putting all those things together. Difficult to cheat. It's easy to do the collection. I don't have to pay a collection site. I get recent use. I pick up the parent marijuana. It's like, why wouldn't you want to at this point in time?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you hit the nail on the head there, but there are a lot of sort of external forces that are driving employers toward oral fluid testing. And it's been a long time in coming. It was 30 something years that DOT only allowed lab-based urine testing. And now 30 years into it, we now have lab-based oral fluid testing regulations. So yep. A lot going on there. Let's talk about compliance. We just have a few minutes to talk about this, and then we'll open up to questions. I know Greta's got some questions for us in the hopper. But before we do that, before we jump all the way into compliance, Greta, let's do our third poll.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, For our last poll, what is your organization's biggest challenge when it comes to workplace drug testing? Marijuana laws and compliance, determining impairment, recent use, hiring and workforce shortages, managing testing costs, keeping up with changing regulations. I'll give everyone a few seconds, and thank you again for participating. Okay, and the results are 11% said marijuana laws and compliance, 16% said determining impairment, recent use, 32% said hiring and workforce shortages, 5% said managing testing costs, and 37% said keeping up with changing regulations.
Yeah, thank you, Greta. Those are fascinating poll results there. 37% said changing regulations, 32% said hiring, and 16% said impairment-related issues as the top three. And then I'll throw marijuana in there as at 11%.
Hey,
So
Bill.
we ask these questions in our annual survey of employers, and usually right towards the top, exactly the same as what you identified in the poll today. Keeping up with changing regulations, state laws that are constantly changing. We track these. We just put out our monthly report called Leg Up, Legislative Update. We just put that out today. There were over 500 bills introduced so far in 2026 that at the state level, various states, that if enacted would have a direct impact on drug-free workplace programs in those states. Now, not a lot of these bills do get passed, but when they do get enacted, it's important to stay on top of those. Maine just changed their drug testing law, just expanded it. Hawaii did recently. I know last year, I think it was last year, Minnesota did to allow point of collection oral fluid testing specifically, not point of collection urine testing, which I found interesting that it wasn't both. It was specific to allowing point of collection or rapid result oral fluid testing. So really important to stay on top of that. But in addition to that, and the reason why I added marijuana to the list, number 4 in the poll results today with all of you, was that those are very common bills that are introduced at the state level. So what we've seen is that a lot of states have passed marijuana laws that allow use for either medicinal or impairment or both, or not impairment, excuse me, the Freudian slip there, for recreational use or both. And then once those laws get enacted, depending on what the state has the appetite for when they do pass that law, then they start chipping away at other issues like discrimination in the workplace or preventing employers from not hiring somebody who tests positive on a pre-employment test like we see in Nevada, et cetera. So you just have to constantly be watching those. We have that service if you're interested in it, and those are available through DrugPak. So let them know, and then we'll put you in touch with the people that can keep you up to date on those changing regulations. Let's just talk about compliance for a minute. I want to just distinguish the fact that, you know, it's hard to give a presentation in sort of a blanket generic way because DOT and non-DOT are very different. Under the DOT regulations, you must test a certain way, you must test specific covered employees, et cetera, et cetera. It's all very dictated. But when it comes to non-DOT, it's governed by company authority, company objectives, and the state laws that apply to you. Now, there are many states that have drug testing regulations that sort of mirror the DOT regulations or the SAMHSA regulations. They'll use different terminology, but it's all the same thing. It's Part 40 of the federal regulations. If you're DOT covered, you must test according to the agency regulations that apply to you. If it's non-DOT, look at the laws. And as I said earlier, if you're in multiple states, you must comply with all of those state laws. So it's not just basing it on your home state of Texas. You must comply with California and Oregon, Washington, et cetera, if you're in all of those states. So there are big differences between DOT and non-DOT programs. Under the DOT regulations, for example, as Brian pointed out, you've got your choice of lab-based urine testing. And now, although there are a couple of pending issues that need to be ironed out, but now we've got regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing about to be available to covered employers. Those are the two testing methods, not point of collection, not hair testing, okay? But in the non-DOT world, compliance-wise, you might have your choice of any of those testing methods that Brian put up on the screen. Now, it depends on the state, but it also depends on the kind of law. So, for example, there are states with mandatory drug testing laws like Iowa. Their law applies to everybody in the state that wants to do drug testing. And states with what are called voluntary laws, like here in Florida where I live, where it depends on if I want to join a workers' comp premium discount program voluntarily. But if I do, I must drug test according to the requirements of that particular program. So you have mandatory laws, voluntary laws. You have states like California that don't have specific drug testing laws. They've got a ton of case law that really sort of governs how drug testing is conducted in that state. You also have workers' comp and unemployment compensation regulations. I'm not talking about the discount laws. I'm talking about the regulations that under certain circumstances allow employers to move to deny workers' comp or unemployment comp benefits, but you must drug test a certain way in many of those states. And then the result must come from that method that's approved by the state. And as I mentioned earlier, there are industry-specific laws like workers are in Illinois, the Public Works Contractors law. In other states, I think Kentucky, maybe West Virginia, where you've got mining industry laws that are specific to that industry. And then, of course, all the medical and recreational marijuana laws. Is it legal to drug test for marijuana? In a marijuana legal state, the answer is almost always yes, but there are some exceptions like New York, as I mentioned earlier, like the city of Philadelphia, where there are restrictions in place. Just know that you can almost always, under most circumstances, test for marijuana, but you may not discriminate against legal marijuana users. And in many of those legal marijuana states, they will actually articulate what that means. So look at the law. Individuals, however, may not use marijuana at work or be under the influence of marijuana while at work. So you still have that right, employers, to prohibit use at work or being under the influence or impaired by marijuana while at work, okay? And as Brian talked about, being able to detect very recent drug use may very well point you toward oral fluid testing, whereas with, you know, if you're looking at lifestyle, you may be looking at urine or hair testing with their longer window of detection. It is important to point out, though, that California and Washington have passed laws that prohibit employers to test workers, and in the state of California, well, in California and Washington, to test job applicants, and in California also employees, for marijuana, and use the result of that test if the test you used only detects the metabolite of marijuana, like urine testing would. But if you're using a testing method that would detect the parent drug, like Brian explained, which is oral fluid testing, then you can test for marijuana in California and Washington, as long as and take, you know, action based on the result when it's positive for THC, but it has to be with oral fluid testing, okay? And there's a whole lot more to go with that. And then something that we're going to do an entire webinar soon, but so many unanswered questions. You're hearing about it in the media a lot, marijuana rescheduling. There's sort of the timeline, but the latest development there is the interim attorney general signing an executive order back in April to begin the process of officially rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1, along with, say, LSD and heroin, to Schedule 3, which is where you'll find Tylenol with codeine. So, you know, they're equating marijuana to Tylenol with codeine as opposed to the more dangerous drugs where it probably belongs. And so as that process takes place, we're fighting for a safety carve-out to make sure that DOT still has the authority to require covered employers and their employees who are in safety-sensitive occupations in transportation to continue to be able to test for marijuana. That's a safety carve-out. You're hearing a lot of that from NDASA, and you'll hear a lot more about it in the coming weeks and months. There are a lot of lawsuits right now being filed to try to halt the rescheduling process without congressional approval. We'll see where any of that goes, but it's very complicated right now. One thing to know, though, is that the rescheduling of marijuana does not federally legalize marijuana use. And there are no FDA-cleared marijuana products on the market for medicinal use at this time. So look at the language of those rescheduling executive orders and know your rights as employers. You still have the right to test for marijuana. You still have the right to prohibit employees from using marijuana in the workplace, even for medicinal purposes, and from being impaired or under the influence of marijuana while at work. And then when I say you still have the right to test for marijuana, It depends on the state and under what circumstances in that state. So look at those state laws very carefully. So a lot of information that we've covered here. Greta, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yes, we do, Bill, for a couple of them. And if we don't get to your questions, we will answer you offline. For our first question, this is a little bit specific and we might have to get back to Kimberly about it, but let's give it a shot. She's asking, are there any circumstances when an employer can request a collection site to conduct a return to duty direct observation for a non-DOT drug test?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. So I would say to Kimberly, first, we need to know the states that you're talking about, or the state, because that's really going to, in most cases, govern the specifics of the answer. And that's probably as far as I want to go with answering that question, only because that would be different from state to state, depending on the circumstances. There's some iffiness to that question. I'll put it that way, but let us know the state. We'll look it up for you and get you an answer.
Sounds good, Bill. For one more, we have time for one more question. If workplace safety is our primary goal, which testing methodology should we prioritize?
You want to go first, Brian?
Yeah, so if safety is really the primary goal, I think you're probably interested in making sure that people are safe when they arrive at work, while they're at work. You know, in many states they're dealing with this issue, and one of the responses that I thought was interesting was to the last poll was people having difficulty hiring. Well, so if you do look at an oral fluid test, you'll know that basically you're picking up the people that are showing up high or coming to work on a substance. You're going to pick them up in the workplace, and that's the most safety, you know, sensitive time that you can have when somebody shows up for work or while they're at work. And so, you know, I'd say that from a method priority standpoint, take a look at oral fluid testing. Not only does it tell you what they're doing, you know, at that time and what's in their system, but on the flip side, it's also not identifying people who used over the weekend in states where, for example, it's the marijuana is legal, or people have the concern about, you know, them being caught for something they're doing on their own time. So oral fluid is not necessarily going to pick that up. So it's really a method that has a lot of pros to it. And so I would say for safety purposes, you know, definitely take a look at oral fluid testing.
That's a great answer, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Bill. Thank you both for a great presentation. Before we close out today's session, we want to thank all of you for joining us. On behalf of the Current Consulting Group and Drug Pack, we hope you found today's presentation informative and helpful. Again, if you submitted a question we didn't get to, we will answer you offline. We will also send you information in a follow-up email on how to access the recorded version of today's presentation, as well as send you continuing education information for those of you that qualify to receive 1 credit for attending today's presentation in its entirety. Thank you for your attendance today, everyone, and this concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.